Have we forgotten the suffering and pain, the survivors and the victims of the fire in Arcane? The mothers and fathers forever to mourn, the 48 children who never came home. It's Christy Moore in They Never Came Home. It's a small house for Saturday morning in the North Dublin parish of Artane, but tonight Kilmore Road is anything but quiet. Disco music blasts from a looming building, the sounds of exhilarated voices and the thump of dancing drift through barred windows. This is the Stardust, and the date, February 14th, 1981. Right now, more than 800 people are inside, attending a disco dance competition. In a few hours, dozens of them will be dead, and hundreds more will be injured. Of those killed, the oldest was 27, the youngest, 16. The Stardust Fire was the most devastating fire in the history of the Irish state. The unimaginable horror and pain of that night created a decades-long fight for justice that is still ongoing. The 1980s were a rough time for Dublin. At this time, Northern Ireland was being torn apart by the Troubles. In 1974, the Republic of Ireland was rocked by car bombs in Dublin and Monaghan, which killed 33 people and injured 258, the worst single-day casualty rate in the whole of the Troubles. Immigration rates were high in the 1980s. Most of those who moved abroad were unskilled or semi-skilled labourers, although many were also university graduates. All in all, there were 185,000 more immigrants in the 1980s than there were immigrants. This was coupled with a growing unemployment rate. On top of this, Ireland was facing an opiate epidemic. And that is just a sample of the difficulties that Ireland was going through at the time. These hardships were particularly felt in North Dublin, a largely working-class area. All of that is to say that the neighbourhoods of Artane, Coolock, and Darndale had taken a lot of hits. Despite this, there was still a sense of community. As Stardust survivor Valerie Deasy put it, people minded people. However, on St. Valentine's Day in 1981, North Dublin would be knocked off its feet. On that day, the communities took a blow that no one should ever have to face: the deaths of dozens of their children. The building, which later became inextricably linked with tragedy, started off as a jam factory. Headed by Patrick Butterley, reportedly a self-made multi-millionaire, the Butterley Group collectively owned or directed around 15 companies at the time. In 1972, the group made the decision to convert part of the building into an amenities centre, which consisted of 3 parts: a lounge/restaurant called the Lantern Rooms, a bar called the Silver Swan, and the Stardust, an area originally intended for live performances. The centre opened its doors in 1978 and quickly became a favourite among the youth in the area. It was the place to be, in part because of the famous acts which performed there. In December 1978, U2 opened for the music supergroup, the Greedies. On the 15th of January 1981, 2 bands, The Specials and The Beat, performed in the club. During the concert, attendees reportedly heard crackling sounds and saw sparks on the ceiling. According to Fiona Doherty, who was in the audience that day, the sparks, quote, "was so big, I wanted to leave." She also added, "I was quite concerned there was going to be a fire." As fortune would have it, she wouldn't be there a month later to see her fears come true. The community was abuzz with excitement in the weeks leading up to the evening of February 13th. The club had arranged a disco dancing competition for that night. Between the contest and St. Valentine's Day, the staff of the amenities centre expected a huge crowd, and they were not disappointed. Fiona Doherty, who attended the concert the previous month, wanted to go but changed her mind. Roughly 800 people attended the competition. One of these was 21-year-old Brian Hobbs from Whitehall, the youngest of 7. His family had no idea he was at the disco. They knew he wanted to attend, but his boss initially refused to give him the time off. Brian worked at a hotel. They were expecting a huge number of guests for St. Valentine's Day. However, his boss relented at the last minute. His parents, Thomas and Marie, were attending a function in the adjacent Lantern Rooms, but they didn't run into each other. Thomas and Marie never saw their son alive again. The first people to see the flames were outside. At about 1:38 a.m., a resident heard crackling and looked out of his window to see 10-foot-tall flames on the roof of the Stardust. At the same time, another resident was woken up by crackling. When she looked out her window, she saw that the club was on fire. At about 1:43 a.m., she realized she couldn't hear any fire trucks, so she called the emergency services. At roughly 1:41 a.m., several people inside the club spotted a seat on fire in the west alcove. No alarm sounded. When the DJ saw the fire, he wanted to tell his colleague, Com, to keep playing for a few minutes and then wrap up, hoping to avoid a panic. However, he couldn't find either Com or his assistant DJ Michael. Meanwhile, the barman, Colm O'Toole, was attempting to fight the fire, but to no avail. Either he or another member of staff opened a shutter separating the west alcove from the rest of the club, which allowed the fire to spread. Mere minutes later, the ceiling began to collapse with pieces falling on the confused patrons below. To call the evacuation chaotic, it would be an understatement. There was no formal evacuation plan, and staff members were forced to improvise. Most of the exits were blocked at some level, so at least one emergency exit was locked, and a skip directly outside another further impeded evacuation. The van was parked outside another exit, making escape difficult. Eyewitness accounts also claimed that multiple exits had chains at the push bars. There was a policy of draping chains over the doors to give the impression that they were locked in order to dissuade people from smuggling friends into the club. Even if the doors were not actually chained shut, many assumed that they were and attempted to find another exit. Some tried to escape through the bathroom windows, only to find themselves trapped inside by steel plates or bars. At 1:51, the first fire engines arrived. Ambulances and members of the Gardaí, the Irish police force, were already on the scene. Dermot Dowdall, a firefighter at Tara Street Station, received a call from fellow firefighter John Fitzsimmons, who was working as a doorman at the Stardust that night. Fitzsimmons warned him that we could lose up to 200 people here tonight. By the time the fire brigade arrived, most of those killed were probably already dead. The fire was extinguished at 3 a.m., but for 48 people, it was already too late. 44 were killed that night. 4 more died of their injuries in the following weeks. Valerie Deasy was one of the first in the club to see the fire. Quoting her, "I looked around for my sister to see where she was, and I went up to her and said, 'Come on, or we better go.' And she said, 'Sure, it's only a little fire.' The fire spread at terrifying speed. Valerie and her sister found an exit, but there was a chain over the bar. In the pandemonium which followed, Valerie was knocked to the ground and trampled. Quoting her again, 'I thought I had died because everything went deathly silent. There wasn't a sound, and it was pitch black.' Then someone pulled her outside. At first she didn't realize how injured she was, but when she spoke to someone she knew, he didn't recognize her. It was then that she realized her face was so badly burned that the skin was peeling off. 16-year-old Phyllis Campbell was working in the Lantern Room's lounge area during the function. At around 1 a.m, she and a co-worker, Paula Foy, took a short break in the West Alcove, but they didn't notice anything unusual. When she was told about the fire in the Stardust, she went to investigate. Before her eyes, flames spread across the ceiling and sent materials raining down. She and Paula tried to escape into the kitchen, but the door was locked. At that moment, the lights went out, but both she and Paula made it out alive. On the outside, Phyllis was forced to listen to the screams of people trapped inside. "Jesus, help us get out." And then silence. She remembers seeing others going back into the club in search of loved ones. Attending the disco competition that night were the Keegan sisters, Antoinette, 18, Mary, 19, Martina, 16. According to their sister Lorraine, quote, "They all left the house so excited." Their original plan was to attend with their 17-year-old brother, John, but John was turned away because of his age. The dance competition was supposed to be restricted to over 21s, but this policy was hardly enforced. Antoinette noted with surprise that the West Alcove was blocked off, something that had never happened before. Antoinette remembers getting drinks with her sisters just before the competition started. DJ Danny Hughes was told by a contractor setting up his equipment that there was a fluctuation in the electrical flow which delayed the show. That night he was being assisted by 17-year-old Michael Barrett, a plumber and aspiring DJ. The bars closed at 1 a.m. and the dance contest started a few minutes later. By the time it ended, it was about 1:30. 3 minutes later, people near the West Alcove noted a rise in the temperature. One source claims that a fireball had flown across the ceiling space, unnoticed by those below. Antoinette described the evacuation as a stampede. Exit 4 was blocked, so they tried to make their way to exit 5. Like Valerie and so many others, Antoinette, Mary, and Martina were pushed to the ground and trampled. The fire was so hot and the smoke so thick that Antoinette was certain they were all going to die. "I saw a person who I couldn't identify, was it male or female, in a ball of flames under the table, and they just kept rolling over and screaming. After that, I just remember my last words. Oh God, please help us." After that, I was unconscious. A man, later identified as 26-year-old Thomas Larkin, tried to pull her out. He had to kick her hands because she was clinging on so tightly to her sister Martina. The pain from the burns in her arms was so bad that she rubbed sand on them in a futile attempt to soothe them. 18-year-old Errol Buckley was one of 2 winners of the dance competition. He was at the disco with his older brothers Albert and Jimmy, and Jimmy's wife Christina. Jimmy, 23, and Christina had just celebrated their daughter's first birthday the previous afternoon. When Errol won the contest, Jimmy was so proud of him that he jumped on the stage to give him a hug. A few minutes later, the fire was spotted, but the group had gotten separated. Outside, Errol spent over an hour searching for the others. Quoting him, "There were girls on fire coming out." He found Christina and Albert, but Jimmy was nowhere to be seen. Eventually, they went home and began searching the hospitals. Brian Hobbs, the 21-year-old hotel employee, wasn't supposed to be there. He was one of the victims. His older brother Peter identified him at the morgue through his clothes, shoes, and belt. The vast majority of victims died from inhaling fumes. Journalists Ken Curran and Charlie Bird were both on the scene as firefighters battled the blaze. Ken Curran spoke to several survivors, quoting him here, "They didn't realize they were cut. They were bruised. There were a lot of them, just looking for friends." When then Taoiseach Charles Hoy arrived, Charlie Bird was allowed to follow him through the Stardust with a film crew. In 2021 interview for the RTE documentary Stardust, Bird commented on how strange it was that this was allowed in spite of the potential risk to forensic evidence. Matthew Quinn, a member of An Garda Slochana, described the scene outside of the club as a pure panic. Quinn used his patrol car to bring the injured to the hospital. Quoting him, "The blisters that were on their arms were massive. Some of them had burst and the skin had fallen down over their fingers like you'd peeled a banana. It was terrible." Once the fire was out, the grisly work of recovering the bodies began. Dermot Dowdall, the firefighter who received one of the calls, found a group of friends in a circle with their arms around one another, fused together. Another firefighter, Paul Shannon, clearly remembers seeing the bodies of two girls laying on a staircase. There were so many bodies that the fire brigade set up a temporary morgue on site. The remains were then hosed down and taken to Dublin City Mortuary. Some of the bodies were so unrecognisable that they had to be identified through personal items. 5 of the victims were not identified until 2007. Valerie Deasy was among the hundreds taken to hospital that day. She spent 10 days in a coma and 3 months in hospital, quoting her, "I do remember at one stage opening my eyes and there was a priest giving me the last rites." When Antoinette Keegan was taken to hospital, she was put on life support. "I was in agony, I couldn't breathe, and my hands were hurting me." Her parents didn't recognise her at first. She overheard a doctor instruct her parents not to give her any bad news, as her survival odds were 50-50. Antoinette spent weeks in hospital, plagued by nightmares of fire. It was by accident that she found out the worst news of all. Her sisters, Mary, 19, and Martina, 16, were both killed in the fire. She found this out when she met a priest at the hospital. When she told him her last name, he said, "Oh yes, that's right. Your 2 sisters died," apparently having no idea that she didn't already know. Antoinette later confronted her parents about this, who admitted that they were told not to inform her because the shock could have killed her. Jimmy Buckley's family spent the next few days searching the hospitals and calling around. The following Tuesday, they received the call that they'd been dreading. At the morgue, they identified Jimmy through his wedding ring. Of the 48 victims, 3 were from the same family: William, George, and Marcella McDermott. William, or Willie, was 22, Georgie, 18, Marcella, 16. Marcella was not meant to be at the disco that night, but she'd skipped out on a babysitting job, only telling her sister Selena. She went with a group of friends and met up with her brothers at the club. According to their sister Louisa, Willie made it out of the club, but went back in for George and Marcella. He died in hospital and later became the first of the 3 to be found by their family. Their sister Selena said in an interview, "I remember my mother. She fell to the ground. She was at home, and she said the other 2 aren't coming back." Marcella was identified through dental records on the 5th of February. George wasn't identified until 11 days later on the 16th. The body of Michael Barrett, the 17-year-old assistant DJ, was identified 4 days after the fire. His family were unable to view the body because it was in such bad condition. He was buried the following Friday. These are just a small sample of the tales of loss and sorrow which emerged from that night. The Stardust fire sent shockwaves through the nation and left everyone wondering how this could have happened. On the 20th of February 1981, a tribunal of inquiry was appointed to look into the causes of death, the circumstances surrounding the loss of life, and the cause of the fire, among other things. The tribunal was headed by Justice Ronan Keane. At first, the families and survivors were hopeful that this would lead to some measure of justice. The tribunal lasted 122 days. At the end, it gave a verdict that devastated those who had already suffered so much. The report concluded that the fire was most likely started deliberately. It also declared that the fire probably started in the West Alcove, where it was first observed by people inside the club. However, the report stated that there is no evidence of an accidental origin, and equally no evidence that the fire was started deliberately. None of the eyewitnesses reported seeing anyone or anything suspicious in the West Alcove in the time leading up to the fire. Because of the lack of evidence, the tribunal instead used eyewitness and expert testimony to rule out various hypotheses until they found what they considered to be the most likely cause and starting location of the fire. The tribunal also found that Eamon Butterley had been recklessly dangerous in his practice of keeping the doors locked and chained until midnight. The full tribunal report is available online. Because of this verdict, in 1983, the Butterley Group was able to make a claim against the local authority, Dublin Corporation, for malicious damages. They were awarded 580,000 Irish pounds, that's over 2 million euros today. Meanwhile, the families and survivors had to contend with the Stardust Victims Compensation Tribunal, which was announced in 1985. The maximum amount that could be awarded to a victim's family was £7,500. Provisions were also made for those who suffered physical and psychological trauma. Although a person could claim compensation for illness caused by mental trauma, grief alone was not enough for a claim. Those who accepted the offer of compensation could not pursue any legal action relating to the fire, and those who didn't were obliged not to reveal the amount that was offered to them. Survivors with physical injuries had to show their scars to the tribunal, even with a medical expert testifying to their wounds. Jimmy Fitzpatrick, who suffered third-degree burns and damage to his lungs, said, "You had to strip basically to your underpants. You just felt like a piece of meat. It was horrible. And what they gave you was peanuts." Jimmy was injured after re-entering the club to rescue two friends. The Stardust fire had an immense impact on a local and a national scale. Of the 48 who died, 44 were in Dublin. Survivors and family members deal with mental scarring and guilt to this day. An unknown number turned to drugs or alcohol to cope. Jim McDermott, the father of Marcella, George and William McDermott, was a firefighter. He was off duty on the night of the Stardust. According to his daughter Selena, after the fire, he attempted to return to his position, but he found it too much, and he retired not long after. The parents began to blame each other. His marriage effectively ended, and he died in 1995 at the age of 64. Bridget McDermott, mother to all the McDermott children, began to shut herself away in a room for days at a time. In an interview, she described her state of mind after receiving news of their deaths, quoting her, "I just couldn't believe it. It took three of my children." She received some mental health support, but walked out after being told that she was, quote, "going mad." According to the report of the Victims' Compensation Tribunal, two unnamed parents died of shock after finding out about the deaths of their children. One woman reportedly died of a heart attack upon hearing the news of her son's death. The scale of the fire shocked the nation and led to a push for more stringent fire safety standards. In 1981, the Fire Services Act placed the onus of fire safety on the owner or occupier of the building while clarifying the powers of fire authorities. Anyone found guilty of breaching this act could be sentenced up to 2 years in prison and or given a fine of up to €130,000. This act, like so many other laws, is written in the blood of those for whom it came too late. The Stardust Fire remains the deadliest fire in Irish history. The families and survivors of the Stardust were outraged by the verdict of probable arson, which they felt tacitly blamed the victims. North Dublin had a high proportion of disadvantaged areas, and its residents are the targets of classist stereotypes. Four journalist Charlie Bird stated at the unveiling of a memorial in 2019, if this fire had been in the south side of Dublin, the answer would have been there by now. Speaking of her experience with the Stardust Victims Compensation Tribunal, survivor Valerie Deasy felt that, quoting her, "They were giving you a sum of money and you were giving them your voice. They were the people that were up there, and you were the mere peasant from Coolock." In 1985, the Stardust Victims Committee was established by John Keegan, father of Mary and Martina Keegan. Keegan wanted to pursue the issue of liability among other goals. Unfortunately, he passed away the next year. His wife Christina and daughter Antoinette took up the fight for truth and justice, along with Bridget McDermott and many others. The group began campaigning for a new inquiry. In 1996, Stardust Memorial Park was opened. It features a fountain, in the center of which stands a statue of two people dancing. In 2004, an amateur researcher named Geraldine Foy, working on behalf of the Stardust Victims Committee, submitted a report to the Department of Justice which disputed the findings of the original tribunal. Though Ms. Foy herself has no scientific or engineering background, Patricia O'Carroll, consultant engineer, pointed out subpar electrical work and walls which were not up to code. O'Carroll concluded that it was impossible to rule out an electrical fault as the cause of the fire. In 2006, around the 25th anniversary of the fire, Eamon Butterley applied for planning permission to open a new bar on the site named the Silver Swan. In response, the Victims Committee held a 10-week protest outside the premises, which only ended when Butterley agreed to rename the pub to the Artane House and build a memorial to the victims. In December of that year, the families and survivors directly addressed then Taoiseach Bertie Ahern in their call for a new public inquiry, restating their belief that there was new evidence to be considered. At the protest, Antoinette Keegan gave an interview with RTE in which she stated, "We don't want to sit down and have tea and sympathy. We want the truth and a tribunal." In response, Bertie Ahern announced a new examination of all evidence. As part of this, the 5 unidentified victims previously mentioned were exhumed for DNA testing. In 2007, the results came back. These were the remains of Michael French, Eamon Loughman, Paul Wade, Richard Bennett, and Murty Kavanagh. The confirmation came as no surprise to their families, but they were glad to be able to finally say a proper goodbye. In 2009, Barrister Paul Coffey published his findings from the examination. He concluded that the 1981 tribunal did not have enough evidence to give a verdict of probable arson. This led to the original verdict being struck from the record, a huge step forward for the families and survivors. However, he also stated that there was no need for a new public inquiry. This was far from the end. The Stardust Victims Committee continued their campaign efforts. In 2004, the Irish police force announced a criminal investigation into concerns of perjury during the 1981 tribunal following a complaint by Geraldine Foy. This complaint was supported by the committee and building engineer Robin Knox. However, in 2016, the Director of Public Prosecutions decided that there was no basis to pursue perjury charges against any witnesses. The following year, a retired judge was appointed to examine potential new evidence, but once again it was determined that no new inquiry was warranted. The year 2019, though, that changed everything. Attorney General Seamus Wolfe ordered a new inquiry on the basis that the original tribunal failed to properly consider the circumstances surrounding the cause of the fire. Darach Markin, a lawyer working for the Victims Committee, stated that if we are correct, if the expert evidence stands up, then the reality is that there are people who must be held accountable for what happened that night. Antoinette Egan said that after hearing of the fresh inquiry, she screamed and jumped around with joy. The new inquests began in April 2023, headed by Dublin City Coroner Dr. Myra Cullinane. The inquiry was the largest in the history of the Irish state, hearing from 373 witnesses. On the first day of the inquiry, Bridget McDermott stated to the news, "I'm happy to be here today, and that's what's kept me alive, to be here today." As witness testimony and evidence came out, the nation was once again shocked. This is only a sample of what was revealed. One of the most unusual aspects of these inquests was the use of pen portraits, which are written statements about a victim delivered by a relative or a loved one. The court heard 48 pen portraits in total, one for each victim, focusing on how they lived more than how they died. In 1981, just weeks before the devastating blaze, a fire surveyor inspected the complex for an insurance quote and found that the fire risk was, quote, pretty horrendous. In particular, he noted that the insulation used in a cold room behind the bar was highly combustible. During his inspection, he also noted a chain on an exit, but was told that the chains would be removed before any patrons arrived. Earlier, we mentioned that attendees at a concert in the Stardust the previous month noticed sparks on the ceiling. The week before the fire, musician Patrick O'Driscoll was performing with his band at the Stardust, when he also noticed sparks raining down from the ceiling like a disaster movie. It lasted a few seconds. In 1981, 20-year-old Michael Kavanagh, a junior doorman at the Stardust, originally stated to the Gardaí that he had opened the exits that night, a claim which he repeated twice to reporters. However, he told some family friends that the doors were locked, and these family friends went to the Gardaí. He testified that later, some of the more senior doormen had visited his home, either to ensure that he would stick to the story or to tell him to recant his statement. After a conversation with his father, he changed his statement to the Gardaí. In his amended statement, he alleged that a head doorman, Leo Doyle, had instructed him not to unlock the doors. When asked at the most recent inquiry if he was part of a conspiracy, he denied it. The inquiry found that an electrical fault in a hot press near the bar was likely where the fire had started. Dr. Will Hutchinson, a fire investigator, testified that the club had several problems with electrical installations. Some of the wiring in the hot press was not properly connected. Additionally, a plastic cup had been removed from the unit, which may have interfered with the thermostat. Finally, the walls of the west alcove were covered in carpet tiles, which were not designed for that purpose. Dr. Hutchinson testified that these combustible tiles contributed to the fire getting so out of control. But where was Eamon Butterley during the fire? The DJ, Danny Hughes, testified that he was standing next to Mr. Butterley when someone came in and said, "Quick, there's a bit of a fire." Mr. Hughes also testified that he heard Mr. Butterley say, "The unknown expletives set us on fire." By the end, the jury had heard more than enough. On Thursday, the 18th of April, 2024, 1 year after the beginning of the inquests, the verdict was announced. Every death was ruled an unlawful killing, a verdict which opens up the possibility of later prosecution. The verdict did not name anyone as being responsible for the deaths. The survivors of the fire and loved ones of the victims were overjoyed to hear the verdict. Louise McDermott, sister of William, George, and Marcella, had this to say: "I just want to say to the 48 now that we're taking you out of the flames, the darkness, and the smoke of the Stardust. We're bringing you back to the sunshine and the light and the music, and you're coming back to us. To home." The Stardust fire is a bloody stain on Ireland's history books. It's possible that without the Stardust and its impact on fire safety regulations, there may have been an even bigger tragedy. However, that does not take away from the agony of losing 48 young lives in one horrific night. Hundreds suffered physical and psychological injury. An uncountable number of people lost loved ones and friends to the blaze. To paraphrase Christy Moore's song from the beginning, let us never forget the pain of the victims and survivors in the fire in Artane.